This is Peter,
And this is Tom.
and you're listening to History Teachers Talking Podcasts. All right, this is Peter Zablocki and Thomas Reska, and welcome back to our podcast. Tommy, what do we got?
Well, today we're going to be looking at an event, probably if you look back at World War II, particularly the war in the Pacific, probably one of the biggest events, but probably one that's not as talked about as much. Everyone kind of knows Iwo Jima, right, with raising of the flag. Obviously, the atomic bombs, maybe they'll know a little bit about Okinawa, and a battle that really changed naval warfare and definitely changed the tide of World War II. So we're looking at the Battle of Midway.
And what's interesting about this, as you mentioned, is that people often, when you think of Pacific warfare, you're thinking of Iwo Jima. First of all, you think of Pearl Harbor, obviously, and we're going to discuss that briefly today. But you're thinking Pearl Harbor, and after that, you're really thinking the island hopping, and you're thinking Iwo Jima, raising of the flag, U.S. Marines Memorial that is in Washington, D.C. I feel like the Navy doesn't get enough credit here, and the Battle of Midway is called the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare. I mean, this thing is studied, actually.
Yeah, when you're outnumbered, and it's a battle where they're using aircraft carriers. Like, this is it. And nowadays, you hear aircraft carrier task group, all that stuff, right? They're sending the aircraft carrier over to this region, that region. That's a big deal. Back in 1942, it still wasn't aircraft carriers. It was still believed that the battleship was still like the backbone and everything. That kind of changed a little bit with the Coral Sea. I guess we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But really, Midway, that's it. That was the end of the battleship. After this, it's like, there's no point. You don't need battleships. You know, they're awesome. They have the big guns. That's great, but it's the aircraft carrier's time.
Yep.
And that basically changed that whole narrative.
And also ironic in this whole thing, when we are going to discuss this today, is the fact that this was, although a huge naval battle, the entire battle took place in the air. I mean, this was a battle of airplanes, not really battle of battleships. All right, where do you want to start? I mean, I figure we'll kind of just run through it, background.
Well, I guess with background a little bit. So let's look. So basically what's taken on, this is the Pacific War, okay, which starts with the bombing of Pearl Harbor for us, December 7th, 1941, which we all basically talk about. So this takes place
6 months
after that, obviously. 6 months after, because it ends in July. So about 6 months after 1942. This is the same people. It's the same people involved too. Yamamoto, who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, also planned the attack on Midway. And his idea was the Japanese Navy, what they wanted to do is they wanted to draw the American fleet into a decisive battle. That was kind of what they wanted to do, to knock them out, defeat the American fleet, and then set up their kind of perimeter around here. And they didn't want to attack Pearl Harbor again because they realized it had too much land-based aircraft. It wasn't going to be smart. So they decided that Midway would be literally a midway point. And by attacking Midway for two things: one, they could then stage other attacks and invasions, but also they knew if they take Midway Island, the Americans would defend Midway because of where it was, and it was very important strategically to protect Pearl Harbor. And if you ever see Midway, it's basically, its name is where it is. It's really in the midway of like the Pacific Ocean. It's like right there.
It's right in the middle between Japan and the United States. After Pearl Harbor, where this was a surprise attack, and they did knock out a lot of the U.S. naval fleet, this was Yamamoto. Yeah, battleships. This was Yamamoto's part 2, the sequel. He wanted to finish them off. As you mentioned, Pearl Harbor was not going to let itself be attacked again. So we really beefed up the ground to air defenses of Pearl Harbor. So he knew there was no way he was going to be able to successfully attack anything that was in port. So the premise here is to trick the American forces, to lure these American aircraft carriers into open sea. And they were going to trick them is really try to attack this smaller island. And draw them out. That's the whole key, right? And this is super secretive. And the reason why it took so long, based on my research, is that Yamamoto was going to go quicker, but there was actually a huge rivalry within Japan between the Imperial Army and the Imperial Navy, Yamamoto's Navy. Because of this, it took forever for them to create this follow-up strategy to Pearl Harbor, because while the Imperial Navy wanted to obviously destroy whatever was left of the American fleet, the Imperial Army was more interested in trying to actually take over some American lands. They were even thinking of, which eventually became part of distraction, but they were trying to attack United States Alaska,
the Aleutian Islands. They were attacked at the same time, and it was kind of like as a diversionary tactic to see where they were going to attack, to divert some forces away from the actual Midway attack
Yep.
to also attack the Aleutian Islands, which they did.
Yep.
Also was not as successful. Was not successful.
So the big plan here was obviously going to rely strictly on surprise. I mean, if they could somehow pass this plan along as like they're sailing to Midway to destroy the American naval base at Midway because there's also a base there. This would be the surprise. However, the reason why this failed, at least based on my research, is from the get-go, and that is the fact of Yamamoto's actual plan, which was to break up his forces.
Well, that was
So,
one reason, and also, I guess, go ahead. But the big reason I would say, you're right.
well, yeah,
Definitely,
yeah. I
Yamamoto's
mean,
plan
yeah,
wasn't perfect, but the big reason was we broke their codes. We knew it was
yes,
coming,
yep,
so they thought they were laying the trap. In actuality, we were laying the trap for them. And
yep.
if they do a really good job of this in that most recent Midway movie
That
that came
supposedly
out,
is one of the most historically accurate
yeah.
movies.
Well, if you saw the one, they made one in the '60s too. That was
Hmm.
actually from like both sides' point of view. It was really a long movie. It's like a 6, 7 hour movie, like the uncut version, and that shows a lot of it. But the newer one that came out, I think like 2019, 2020, it was actually it was really well done. They actually show us and how nervous the Americans were planning this because like if this didn't go well and we send our fleet out and our fleet gets beaten, that's it. Because we have to understand here too, in good context, is the United States is not the United States today. Just the United States 1942. It's not the U.S. Navy of today. It's the U.S. Navy of 1942. So it's not this like massive sized Navy right now. Like our Navy right now is what was I reading that we're
Oh, wait,
bigger
I'll edit. Yeah.
than the next 11 navies combined. That's how
Yep.
big the U.S. Navy is today. And out of those 11, no, excuse me, out of those, we're bigger than the next 13 navies combined. Out of those 13, 11 are allied NATO countries. So that just
Yep.
kind of tells you like the
Yeah.
size of the Navy today. And we were not that in 1942. In fact, the Japanese Navy at that point was on a 50-year undefeated streak. They did not lose a battle or engagement in 50 years prior to Midway. Even the battle right before this, the Battle of the Coral Sea, was really like a draw.
Yep.
Like when they were going towards Japanese were going to Australia, it was kind of a draw. But when they come to Midway, things are going to change. So it was really the United States was not confident necessarily that they were going to win, and they also knew going in that they were going to be outnumbered. I'm going
Yep.
to give you some of those statistics in a few minutes.
Just going into this idea of obviously our naval code breakers, what the actual code that we broke, we refer to it as magic. So yeah, we broke it, and we were able to listen to these Japanese radio messages. However, a few things here. The reason why Yamamoto was actually using radio so much to communicate, which is why we were able to pick up so much of this strategy, is because he actually dispersed his fleet. So his entire
Yeah.
plan was like a three-prong attack. He was going to initially, there was, like I said, diversion attack, smaller Japanese force right in the islands off of Alaska. Then Yamamoto's three-prong attack was basically first an air attack on the island was going to be launched from 4 first-line Japanese aircraft carriers. He basically sent out 4 aircraft carriers going forward, right? What were the names of them? Do you remember? Akagi,
I do have.
Kaga,
Yeah.
Hiryu, and Soryu, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are them.
Commanded right, commanded by Vice Admiral Nagumo. Then the second force was an invasion force. It was ships, battleships, soldiers, and that was led by Vice Admiral Kondo. And that one was further out, like that was nowhere near the actual 4 battleships. And then after that, once supposedly they attacked Midway, the U.S. reinforcements were expected to come from Pearl Harbor. And at that point, when they were coming from Pearl Harbor, there was going to be Yamamoto's own fleet, which was hiding even further out, 600 miles away to the west, would then arrive and be like, ha, we're here as well. The fact that he kind of sent out these first 4 aircraft carriers by themselves and separate all these other forces to make it look like, oh, this is all you got to fight, was his downfall for many reasons. One, because when we intercepted them, his main force was not all in one place. And 2, because he had to communicate via radio between all these different forces, which is what our code breakers were listening to. And what was
Yeah.
interesting here too is, I don't know if you saw this, but we knew more or less when this was happening, but we weren't sure where they were going to attack.
Until
Because they
we lay a trap for them. Yeah.
exactly right, because they kept on referring to the specific location as to where they're going to attack the
AF.
U.S.
AF. They kept on seeing
AF.
this thing right popping up. AF.
Yeah. So what do we
Um,
do?
So AF keeps on popping up, and there's these code breakers that are saying it's Midway, and a lot of the other again, you see the movie and you do the research. A lot of the other code breaks are like they don't think it's Midway. Like, all right, this is how they can figure it out. They send out a fake message. that they know the Japanese are going to intercept, saying that Midway is running low on fresh water and needs resupply. And
Mm-hmm.
then the next day, they intercept a message that says AF running low on fresh water. So bam, that just confirmed everything. So as soon as that comes out, they confirm that AF is Midway. So all they're talking about all these attacks, when they're going to attack, where the all the strike force is going to be attacking AF. They know AF is now Midway. So this is when the U.S. like, all right, let's go. This is when Nimitz, right, is saying basically, let's do
Yep.
this. Okay, let's lay this trap now, and we're going to be waiting for them. When they come, they're not going to know where our aircraft are, and we're going to be waiting for them, and that's going to be the big deal.
Yep. And a keynote here too, which is interesting because we were able to intercept those messages, is the fact that the United States technically did not have enough. How many did we have before the Yorktown was fixed up? What do we have? 2 aircraft carriers?
Yeah, well, that's the big thing that you have to understand. Going into this battle, the U.S. was not. Yeah, Yorktown was severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea. We talked about this a
Yep.
couple of times. It was the first time in naval combat history that the two sides never saw each other. It's the first time airplanes. It's kind of like a prequel to Midway.
Yep.
But coming in, the Japanese had 4 aircraft carriers, right? 4 of them, 7 battleships, 150 ships, support ships, 248 carrier aircraft, and 15 submarines. All right, the U.S. had 3, but only 2 of them were totally ready because the Yorktown was still in dry dock. It was supposed to take up to 6 months to repair it, and then instead,
They did it in like 48 hours, right?
Yeah. They were really just like to get this thing back out there. Only 50 support ships, 230 carrier-based aircraft. They had Midway itself had 127 land-based craft, like torpedo planes and stuff, and they had 8 submarines. So it was a much smaller force. The U.S., if you were lining these up, you would not. That's one reason why this battle is always like analyzed in like naval history and stuff. The U.S. should not have won. I know this is sounding very, very pro-U.S. Look, we're the underdog against Japan, but these forces really were. They were not as experienced. They were not. They didn't have the numbers, and that all they knew is they did have the element of surprise. You can see how big that can be, and they got lucky too, which we'll talk about. The luck was a big part of this, and it was kind of Yamamoto and the other commanders, their lack of being able to make decisions quickly. And their lack of like really backing up their decisions is also what gave like the Americans a window to really try to like win this battle, and they took advantage of it. And that's really what you have to do here. They really definitely took advantage of the opportunities that they had.
Yep. And also, based on their intelligence, the Japanese really did think that the U.S. is only going to have 2 aircraft carriers that were full of airplanes.
They didn't expect. They had no idea.
Expect Yorktown.
No one did, and that was the point. You couldn't expect the Yorktown. You have to remember the Japanese at this point, like their industry was nowhere close to the United States. And that's something that Yamamoto talked about. If you obviously, I fear we have wakened a sleeping giant. If you look at our Pearl Harbor podcast, we talk about that because he knew that eventually the United States industry would overtake Japan. Japan just couldn't keep up with that. Just couldn't keep up with the industry. And you really saw this at this battle. Like, how is this aircraft carrier? When the Japanese first encounter it, they don't think it's a Yorktown. They think it's a brand new carrier. Like, how did they build a new carrier in this amount of time? How did we even know about this carrier existing? So that's just kind of what happened.
We were just the Pearl Harbor dry dock #1 at Pearl Harbor. They said,
just fix it.
They were like around the clock, 24 hours a day.
Get it done. Yeah.
Patched it up and they got it done. Let's get into, I guess, kind of this idea. I mean, we have the Yamamoto's plan, right? He's going to send out these 4, pretend that's really it, and then he's going to destroy. So at least he's hoped to destroy Midway, and then after that, he has another fleet waiting further out with actual soldiers on that he's thinking are going to actually land. And then when the Americans send out their guys from Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto will bring his own big force and then basically destroy the Americans.
Well, the battle's going to start. So it starts on June. It goes from June 4th to June 7th, 1942. Again, if you look at Japanese records, I think it's the 3rd to the 6th. It all depends on, It starts at about 9 o'clock in the morning. Mm-hmm. Some of the Navy, both sides are sending out spotters. Remember, this is before they have sonar, they have radar, but it's not anything like it is today. They don't have the drones flying by like the satellites. So they just send out guys up in planes, and they're going to fly around and try to spot the Japanese forces. And that's when a U.S. Navy patrol actually spotted the Japanese force about 500 nautical miles southwest of Midway.
But they spot the wrong force. They don't.
He
right?
He thought this was the main task force, and it wasn't. So what happens is Midway launches 9 B-17s to do their first attack on this transport, and they get there, and they're just basically they drop their bombs. They cause minimal damage, if anything. None of the bombs actually hit anything, and I think all of them wind up getting shot down pretty much. And that's what's happening a lot. And the Japanese, if you do the research and you read some of their journals, they talk about this early on. And they kind of are laughing at the Americans. Like, it's not like they're brave, they're fighting, but they have no idea what they're doing, because we're setting up these torpedo planes, we're sending up these bombers, and they're just getting slaughtered on their way. And none of their bombs are hitting the target.
By much faster
Much
fighters, fighter
faster,
planes.
more experienced pilots. So then about 4:30 on June 4th is when Nagamo, right, he's the fleet commander, launches his initial attack on Midway itself.
They from his 4 aircraft carriers. Yep.
Yes, from his aircraft carriers, and they actually start attacking Midway itself, the actual island. And then about an hour or so later is when another plane spots 2 more Japanese carriers, and that's when they realize, oh man, there's a whole bunch of planes flying everywhere. And about 10 minutes later is when the island was attacked again. So the war's on, the battle's on here. And then Midway radars picking up enemies at a distance, so the interceptors are scrambled. There's bombers flying everywhere. So it's basically becoming like a huge, this battle's happening out in the ocean and at Midway itself all at the same time. I mean, we don't have to get into like at 10:25.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly. Like when you start reading this, it's so overwhelming.
It's so overwhelming because it's such a detailed battle, because both sides, detail that. But basically, we have to understand is at one point the Japanese spot the American carriers, and that's when they're like, oh my God, this is a trap. They realize it, right? It's their Admiral Akbar moment. Okay, some people actually get that reference, right? So they realize what's going on. And that's when Nagamo has this like dilemma, because he doesn't know what to do, because their main objective is to destroy the fleet. So he's like, okay, we have to, if we're attacking aircraft carriers, we need to convert to torpedo planes, right? But if we're attacking the land at Midway, we're doing bombers. So they kind of switch back and forth a couple times, right? He wants to put the bombers, he wants to attack Midway itself, but he has orders from Yamamoto, which says no, that he has to keep certain aircraft in reserve, because they have to make sure that they go and attack the carriers. That's what Yamamoto really wants destroyed. So it's kind of this back and forth and this indecisiveness that's happening. And as that's happening, remember, the battle's still going on. So as that's happening, on the battleship, they're switching from bombs to torpedoes, and they're refueling all these planes. And as they're doing that,
while they're refueling the ships, but that's when the actual bombs start dropping on American bombs start to drop on these aircraft carriers, right? And ultimately, because they actually pierce the top of the aircraft and they go into the lower decks, because you have all these airplanes that are being refueled, that ignites and starts internal fires within 3 of these aircraft carriers.
Yeah, within minutes. Within minutes. That's what people don't like. This happened within minutes. The Hiru, the Soru, and the Kaga are all attacked.
After this, for the remainder of the war, the Japanese changed their orders that planes were to be refueled only on the very top of the aircraft carrier, no more in its hull.
Yeah, because when you drop one bomb in there with all that fuel, right? Gasoline, all those other bombs, it just ignites everything. You only need one bomb. Several bombs hit. So, and they do a great job in this movie. Those pilots were actually like on their way, getting ready to turn back, because they didn't even know where the fleet was. They suddenly come to the cloud cover. They look down, they're like, oh, look, there's a Japanese fleet. They were actually kind of lost. Yeah, they weren't sure exactly where they were, and they see it. And these are dive bombers. So like, I don't know if people understand what dive bombers are. It's not like today when you have like the laser scopes. You just kind of like line up your plane in the scopes and you fly towards the deck of this.
Yep. And at the last minute, you pull up.
Yeah, last possible second, you pull up, and you're hoping that the gravity kind of just guides the bomb the rest of the way.
That's all it is.
And that's basically what it is.
And we should mention the fact that like our dive bombers were doing okay. However, our torpedo bombers, I mean, they were terrible. And apparently, like, our torpedoes would just like miss the ships. There were
some torpedoes hit but didn't explode. Like the ones that they get through hitting, and like we were not. Yeah, we were lucky.
And there was an ongoing joke that those that flew torpedo planes were like, dude, like, why are the torpedoes here? You don't do anything for us. Like, the dive bombers like almost resented the fact that the torpedo guys were there, because they didn't really help them out. And that kind of stems from the United States eventually got it together and figured out how to build better torpedoes. But at least during this battle in 1942, we're still kind of a little off on that. Even though the 3 ships, they don't sink technically. They're just on fire.
It's the Akaga, the Kaga, and the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu. Yeah, they're on fire. They're really damaged. There's no way to fix them. That's it. Like, they're going to be, they're taking on water. Some are going to sink. Some are going to be attacked. The battleships will blow up themselves.
And eventually, actually, the Japanese blow some of them up. They're like, you know what? We're not like, we can't tow this ship right here. So they wind up sinking their own ship as they're getting off them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's when I said the battleships. The one Japanese surviving carrier, the Hiru, launched 2 waves of attacks on the Yorktown. The Yorktown at this point was severely damaged early on in the battle. It's already been abandoned, but it was still floating. They did such a good job of fixing it. So as they're doing that, however, because the Japanese they wanted to get some sort of like revenge, right? That was like their big thing. And as they're doing that, the U.S. dive bombers from all three carriers returned and attacked the Hiru, and it's the ablaze. So all four Japanese carriers were out of commission at this point.
Yep.
So that last one does attack the Yorktown, and it does set the Yorktown ablaze. But then now we know where they are, so we send all of our remaining waves over there. We take
It was
we
kind
take
of,
out the Hiru.
but that whole Yorktown was kind of interesting because we actually started salvage efforts on Yorktown. Like as Yorktown's destroyed, basically, we're like, you know what, we could still salvage the ship. So they send the Hammond. I think Hammond is
The
the
Hammond, yeah.
ship that's towing Yorktown, which is again, it's ablaze, it's taken in water, but like we could do this. So it's actually it was taken in tow. It was two things. It was Hammond and the USS Vero, I think. And as it's doing that, a Japanese submarine somehow manages to slip through all the American destroyers. And they're saying that's perhaps because there was just so much debris in the water that they missed it. So this Japanese submarine gets through these American battleships and fires just one, like one torpedo, which happens to strike the Yorktown. And then at that point, there wasn't really that many people on the crew of the Yorktown anyway, because most of them have been evacuated. Then it fires another one, and then finally a third one. The third torpedo strikes the USS Hammond, which was right
That sinks
there.
fast.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that was there, like providing basically power to the Yorktown. The Hammond breaks into and sinks. It cost Americans 80 lives, and then at that point, it was basically hopeless. They're like, all right, like Yorktown's not working out. So all the repairing crews, everything was taken off of Yorktown. So interesting enough, it survived this this aircraft carrier survived Midway, almost survived Midway, and then it was destroyed by a submarine, not a dive bomber.
Not the actual, yeah. Well, the battle still gets going on.
Yeah,
But by this point on June 6th, yeah, Yamamoto ordered his ships to retreat. He was pretty much,
yeah,
there's nothing else we can do. And the Americans were kind of like, said, all right, we're just going to let them go. Like, that's it. Like, they're like, why didn't we push it any further? They're like, their troops were battle weary. It was a victory. It's an overwhelming victory. Let's not push our luck anymore. Because it ended Battle of Midway. So Japan lost about 3,000 men. And about 200 of the most experienced pilots. They lost nearly 300 aircraft, one heavy cruiser. But the big thing is they lost all four aircraft carriers. The Americans lost the Yorktown, the Hammond, like you talked about 145 airplanes, most of them those torpedo bombers that we talked about that just couldn't
yep.
do it, and about 360 servicemen. So it was an overwhelming victory for the Americans. And at this point, Japan had to end its expansionist plans in the Pacific. They were done. Now they would be on the defensive for the remainder of World War II. So it pretty much injected the United States a lot of like confidence,
Yep.
and it destroyed Japanese morale. They were just like, they actually kept it secret for a while. It wasn't for like a year or two later before it was like revealed to like the general public what happened at Midway. But it was
Yeah.
definitely the turning tide of the war in Japan, in favor of the Allies, big time. Like this is it. If you want to like the tipping point of World War II in the Pacific, it's Midway. All the other stuff that we talked about earlier, like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, that doesn't happen without Midway. You can't island hop with the Japanese fleet being that strong. You knock out four aircraft carriers in one battle like that, they can't recover. Japan never recovers from this. They don't have the industry to recover. They make a few more aircraft carriers, but it's too little, too late.
Well, even like how Japan refused to even acknowledge this, they didn't really
Yeah.
say this or admit it to the public at all. Much of the public, as well as really the military command structure, is kept completely in the dark about this. There's like, yeah, there was a battle, we took some losses, but actually, the Japanese news, as far as people are concerned, announced that this was a great victory, and really only the emperor and the naval command personnel, like really high up there, the admirals, were really accurately informed of the fact of how much damage was really suffered here. They actually tricked the Imperial Japanese Army in believing that, at least for a little bit, they tricked them, believing that the Japanese fleet was still in good condition and still had superiority in the Pacific Ocean, even though it did not. What I found interesting too is that the return of the Japanese fleet, right, whatever was left of them after Midway, all the wounded were immediately transferred to naval hospitals, but they were classified as secret patients. So they were placed in isolation wards, quarantined
They
from
couldn't
other
see their
patients.
family. Yeah.
Yep, couldn't see family, anybody else. This was like literally keep the defeat as secret as possible. And then all the remaining officers and men that survived, even those that got better from these hospitals, were then quickly dispersed into other units and sent back out in other fleets. They never saw their friends. They basically were shipped right to South Pacific, where a majority of them actually died in battle. It was almost like considered that at South Pacific, they were not doing so well. So it's like they send them to their death.
They want them talking about. They don't want them to
Yeah.
tell
Like
people. They
no
don't
one
want the
should
general
know.
public to hear about what happened at Midway, because they expected we'll still win the war. Everything's still going to be fine. and we'll just, we'll just sweep it under the rug. But it didn't actually go that way. So I know you remember, I'm sure, from our days in college, right? John Keegan, he's a British military historian. He writes that the Battle of Midway was the first major naval victory of the Allied forces, and it was the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare. Because again, it was a battle no one expected. The Americans would win, not even them. And it was such a it was like a gritty battle. No, it's like they wiped out like 3 aircraft carriers in about 6 minutes.
Yep.
Right. And then it's this decisive battle. It was a one-sided battle. You can't argue. Like Coral Sea can be argued one way or the other. There's other battles can be argued one way or the other. Not Midway. Midway is 100%, hands down, overwhelming victory by the U.S. Navy over the Japanese Imperial Navy, which at that point was undefeated for 50 years.
Yep.
So it was the major naval power in the Pacific, and now it's done. So in that one battle, the naval power that was Pacific is now reduced to on defensive stature, and now it's the United States. That's it. And then the United States hasn't looked back if you look at militarily, as naval power.
Yep.
From that point on.
And it's kind of also like just tacking on to this idea of turning points of the war here. The issue here was that Japan really lost a lot of pilots when it comes to this battle. They could never really train new ones enough. Yeah. Yep. So they said that these replacement pilots were like pushed through in really quick training regiments, and just so they could be brought back, because Japan did eventually get new aircraft carriers. It's not like we destroyed all the aircraft carriers. The issue was that the United States industry was producing aircraft carriers at such a pace that we were able to replace all of ours, plus add like 12 more by the end of the year, versus the Japanese just managed to replace their 4 by the end of the year. We had like over 12 by then, and that's the difference. We were producing, they were not. Concurrent with that is the fact that they rushed these pilots to essentially man these airplanes on these new aircraft carriers by 1943, and they were very inexperienced, and because they were losing them at such a quick pace, they weren't really able to have any veterans that, specifically after Midway, to send back to train these and that new
was the
pilots.
main problem. Like the United States, eventually, when you became like a lot of the pilots from Midway became flight instructors then, and taught a lot of the tactics to other pilots coming through. Teach what you know. Then the Japanese didn't do that. No, you just keep on fighting
until you die, really.
Until you die, right? Yeah, but then you're not passing on that knowledge, that expertise, and plus, by the time the United States starts making more advanced aircraft like the Hellcat and stuff like that, forget it. There's the Japanese. Once the Zero becomes obsolete, they have nothing left.
Yeah. The U.S. created basically after Midway, and after they were able to use these pilots that were so experienced to train these new pilots, as you mentioned, they created, because of Midway, this rotation system where they would basically, like, you were not really allowed to stay too long on an aircraft. The idea was like, we don't want you to die. You got your experience. They would like rotate them back into the academies to train new pilots. So it was the idea of always retaining veterans on the U.S. Naval Air Forces, which I thought was kind of really cool. The one thing I found really kind of cool, which took obviously years, but was the discovery of the Yorktown, which I think is kind of cool because it took until 1998, and it was the guy that was responsible for finding the Titanic in 1980. It's the same guy, and a team of different scientists and actually Midway veterans from both sides helped locate, and they photographed the Yorktown, which is about almost 17,000 feet deep underground. And they were looking for this since really the 40s, and they didn't find it until 98. Apparently, it was almost intact as it sunk in 42. They said original paint was still on it, equipment, everything else. That same group tried to continue to search for the Japanese carriers, but they were unable to find them. Then there was like a Joint Expedition 99 that searched for the Japanese aircraft carriers, and they used obviously new technology, computers, whatnot. And they did locate a large piece of the Kaga, I think. And then in 2019, you have a joint Japanese-American Navy research vessel that's sent out, and you basically did locate the actual Kaga altogether. They found the whole thing, and it was at like 17,700 feet beneath the waves. Then they found a discovery also in 2019. They finally discovered the Kagi. So, people are still looking for these things, which is kind of neat.
Yeah, they're there. I mean, the remains are going to be there. These are giant steel ships. Like, it's going to be down there still, even 70 years later,
And John Ford, who's a very known Oscar-winning director of, the United States, was actually there to film this whole thing on Midway, which became a documentary, one of the first documentaries, really successful documentaries. John Ford, again, already an Oscar-winning director, a lot of westerns, often known for collaborating with John Wayne. He was an officer in U.S. Naval Reserve and was tasked with making this documentary film for the Navy, just overall. And he happened to be on Midway when Midway was attacked. So he winds up suffering like a bomb concussion. He has gunshot wounds during this raid. But like you could see the raid itself. Like we see the attack in color because a Hollywood director's like recording as it's happening, which is kind of interesting. It was known, the actual documentary is known as the Battle of Midway. You could probably find it on YouTube. And it won an Oscar for the best documentary in 1942, which is kind of cool. Any fun facts here that we got?
There were a couple American soldiers that actually were captured.
I did see that. It's kind of sad.
We're aware of that, and they were killed. They believe they were killed, or from accounts from the Japanese sailors in the ships, is that they were tied to anchors and thrown overboard as they were returning back to Japan.
I did,
which was that. Which was common on what they were going to do, like what they did at the time. It was it was war. We're not bringing you back to Japan with us, so here you go.
Crazy.
Especially after they lost those 4 aircraft carriers, they wanted revenge. So
yeah. So Midway, guys, in case you're ever interested, you could obviously find. There's so many documentaries on this, but if you're not into documentaries, there's, like we said earlier, 2 feature films on this. One older, more classic one, and one more current one, which was actually, the current one was actually a pet project of the director. Did you see that?
Yeah, it was an independent film. Yeah. It was the most expensive independent film. They had like major actors in it.
Yep.
Oh, Harrison, I think, is in it.
Yep.
Dennis, what's his name?
Quaid. Is it Quaid?
Dennis Quaid. Yeah, Dennis Quaid. Yeah. I think he's Halsey in it. So no, like I said, Jonas brother. One of the Jonas brothers are in it, I believe.
But anyway, so I think that kind of concludes our podcast, right, on the Battle of Midway. Again, it's a fun one for us. I mean, I knew this was your thing, Tom, so I was like, all right, we're gonna let Tom like unleash his knowledge here.
Well, I was just one of the Pacific Wars. Yeah,
that's your thing.
Not about knowledge, but it's just
it's your thing.
I got a little bit. Yeah, I guess it's my area where I study a little bit, or if I like.
Well, both of us took at least 2 classes in Pacific War and Japan history with Professor Cook, Dr. Cook, remember, in college, who was actually a former CIA agent. It was crazy. Those are the days. But anyway, see, so if not that he's listening to this, but anyway, thank you, Professor Cook. Yes. All right, guys. If you need to find us, talk to us, or if you need to email us or anything else, you could do so at www.historyteacherstalkingpodcast.com. We are there. Wherever you listen to this podcast, do not be afraid to click that little subscribe button. Also, leave us a review if you like what you hear. And if you don't, then don't. Besides that, I hope everyone has an amazing week, and we will see you guys next week. Enjoy.
Stay safe, everybody.
I hope everyone enjoyed our podcast, and if you would like to email us, you can do so at historyteacherspodcast@gmail.com.